they were making beer at the time. In some cases, beer was probably laced with psychedelics, so they're getting crossfaded even back in the day. What's up, guys? This is Alan again, back with another episode of Off the Clock podcast. And today we're going to talk about this article I found. It's called Drinking Culture, Why Some Thinkers Believe Human Civilization Owes its Existence to Alcohol. So let's take a look at this article. To some people, alcohol is a scourge of humanity that can do no good. It's true that booze is directly and indirectly responsible for many pitfalls in society, from drunk driving to increased risk for cancer. But what if alcohol was not merely a vice, but one of the triggers that sparked the dawn of human civilization? In essence, the very thing that shifted us from hunter-gatherers to agrarians. Even before reading this article, I actually read this somewhere before, in that modern civilization can't even exist without alcohol. Mainly because a lot of things are done with alcohol. Back in the early times, beer and wine was the safest sources of water because the water was dirty and they didn't understand why drinking lake water could get you sick. So let's read on. This is a provocative thesis, one that might upset Puritans, yet it has some serious adherents, including philosopher Edward Slingerland. Oh, there's a typo here. Is it Slingerland or Singerland? Anyways, Slingerland believes alcohol may have helped shape human evolution from the very beginning and continues to have positive benefits to society beyond providing a socially acceptable form of euphoria, which, I mean, it depends how much you drink. In his 2021 book, Drunk, How We Sipped, Danced, and Stumbled Our Way to Civilization, Slingerland lays out the case that alcohol may have been even the impetus for humans developing agriculture and complex societies. But this idea so intrigued him that he delved in, finding evidence that, as he writes, various forms of alcohol were merely not a byproduct of the invention of agriculture, but actually a motivation for it. That the first farmers were driven by a desire for beer, not bread. This is a theory. This is called beer before bread. Some people think that bread came first and then beer, but there's actually more evidence that beer came first, and it's mostly done, people left some grains outside, it rained, some of the grains started malting, germinating, breaking down the starches to release fermentable sugars, and then you get the wild yeast falling down and created this low alcohol porridge, which then the farmers started to refine until the alcohol came up, and eventually beer was made and it was less sludgy. So that's the theory, the beer before bread hypothesis, I would say. There seems to be a lot of interest in civilization sort of being formulated from different intoxicants, especially psychedelics. But I think alcohol can kind of be overlooked in that equation. So this is just to clarify, this is an interview. It was sort of there at the dawn of history. We don't talk about it. It's not a good thing. Well, alcohol's not cool right now. Psychedelics are super cool. Cannabis is pretty cool. So I just think alcohol has kind of been overlooked or even devalued because it's kind of drug your uncle uses, right? And alcohol has a lot of problems. Believe it or not, we actually drink way less alcohol than early Americans. Even children drank hard liquor, back in the day. They would wake up and take a shot of whiskey, or they will actually put whiskey in regular water and leave it overnight until the whiskey completely kills all the microbes that are living in the water and making it safe. Despite a lot of problems being caused by alcohol in today's society, people in early times drank a lot. The British Navy, for example, had a daily ration of rum and gin until the 1970s. They had basically a pint of gin a day, which is a lot. Especially the proof that they had in those navies were way higher than 80 proof. So they were consistently drunk. And the fact that they only recently stopped in the 70s is kind of crazy that you would let people monitor a ship with cannons and stuff while and most of the time they were freaking wasted. I think one of the more justified reasons that people are worried about alcohol is that it has negatives like drugs like cannabis and psychedelics don't have. It's much more physiologically harmful than either of those drugs and is physically addictive in a way that those drugs aren't. Yeah, believe it or not, people did drink a lot during the lockdown, but right after lockdown, there was a huge, popularity of bars and stuff. But now there's a whole line of non-alcoholic gins, non-alcoholic whiskeys, non-alcoholic beer. So even a lot of bars I've seen have non-alcoholic options now. So even working at a bar right now, people are asking for NA options. I wouldn't say that it's not cool, but it's becoming okay to not drink in the bar. People are less judgmental on people who don't drink. Can we discuss a couple of examples of how alcohol played a positive role in the evolution of human civilization? We've known for a really long time about the natural fermentation of yeast. So we know that people drank alcohol either intentionally or not, because alcoholic fermentation is a spontaneous reaction. Modern distillation and fermentation techniques are refined with cultivated yeasts, but it can happen just with the yeast that's in the air. It might not taste as good, but it's still spontaneous. All you have to do is crush grapes and it immediately starts to ferment. Believe it or not, people who are trying to sell grape juice were actually trying to figure out how to have grape juice not turn into wine. That's how spontaneous it is. It's actually hard to make things not ferment. And we know that animals also eat fermented mangoes and stuff and get intoxicated too. So even animals in the wild partake in consuming alcohol. Standard story that I always assumed that before I started doing research, that's that humans invented agriculture. We settled down into large-scale societies. We've grown crops. And we figured by accident that if we left our sourdough starter out too long, it will bubble. So yeah, sourdough does, when you let it sit, it does generate a small amount of like what they call hooch, which is like a layer of alcohol. And it's very, very low because sourdough isn't just yeast. There's also bacteria in it. And it's usually multiple types of yeast because, whereas when you do a more refined method of fermentation, you have a single strain of, or sometimes like Four Roses has multiple strains of yeast, but they are bred specifically to be more cleaner fermentation, whereas these wild fermentations are generally alcohol isn't like the main goal. So the beer before bread hypothesis, which is what I mentioned earlier, 13,000 years ago, so building these monumental religious sites and feasting involved eating meat and other kind of high value items, but also drinking beer. So sites like this, they're drinking some kind of liquid. We know the area they were making beer at the time. In some cases, beer was probably laced with psychedelics, so they're getting crossfaded even back in the day. So in that respect, the desire to get intoxicated actually led to civilization. What motivated hunter-gatherers to start cultivating crops and settling down. And you see this pattern much around the world, not just blah, blah, blah. So that's interesting. Like, I knew that fermentation happened before agriculture, but what makes this thing interesting is that this person thinks that it actually was the main reason why we got into crops. If you look around the world, the first cultivated crops tend to be plants that must have been chosen for the psychoactive properties, not for the nutritional properties. And so that's behind this idea that this desire to get cognitively altered that motivated hunter-gatherers to settle down and start living in these large-scale societies. Getting intoxicated is an ancient behavior, and it actually is probably one of the motivations for creating civilization in the first place. So that's interesting that there's actually evidence that the intoxicants, not just alcohol, were the first few crops. It's really fascinating to think about this. I like to put myself in that time period and think, why would people start planting plants on purpose? It was like, if this is a seed that's responsible for this behavior, if I put this in the ground, I can expect this later. Once again, these are all hypotheses, so we don't know. So yeah, that's Michael Pollan's argument. This guy's written a lot of really good books on food, in caffeine. So yeah, definitely recommend reading some of his works. He also has a Netflix special on food. If you take a plant eye view of it, you see humans serving plants and kind of eliminating their enemies and giving them nutrition. One way to look at it is these plants domesticated us. I think that it's rhetorically kind of a conceptual turn. So that's kind of interesting that certain things like corn, modern corn cannot grow in the wild. It has to be cultivated by people. The crop has been influenced by humans so much that it can no longer survive and reproduce on its own anymore. There is a sense in which we domesticate ourselves in the process of domesticating plants. Hunter-gatherers live pretty varied lifestyles. Geographically, they'd wander around, ate varied diets. As a member of a group, you would typically engage in a lot of different activities. You would forage, you'd hunt, you'd be cooking. Once you move into an agricultural community, your life often takes a turn for the worst. Your diet gets more monotonous. Your life probably gets more monotonous. You're stuck in the field, sticking seeds in the ground instead of wandering around hunting things. You're crowded together with other people in a way that humans never were before. You're living in denser communities. So if we want to talk about the role of alcohol in domesticating humans, one of the ways that it helped us make this transition is that it helps relieve anxiety and stress. If humans were motivated to settle down and start agriculture by the desire to get intoxicated, the act of getting intoxicated also helped them to adapt to this new lifestyle. I actually read a book by Eckhart Tolle, and he actually mentions how anxiety causes a lot of issues with people, and the reason why people drink is to calm down their anxiety. And in a way, I think this is true. Think about how many times people get in a fight or they hate their job, and the first thing that they want to do is drink because it helps numb the mind. And a lot of people think that without drinking, then people won't even be able to tolerate each other's. Alcohol also helped create group bonds. Another crucial function of alcohol, in my view, is to help humans overcome these cooperation dilemmas. Yeah, that's what I mentioned. When we're cooperating with strangers, which we do all the time in large-scale societies, one of the main functions of alcohol is to downregulate the prefrontal cortex. Just going back to Eckhart Tolle, talk about how the mind is not your friend. Our mind sometimes causes us anxiety, self-defeat, and self-sabotage. And one way that people numb this part of the brain is to drink alcohol. That's what they used to do to soldiers to go to war, is that they would have them liquored up because otherwise they would get scared and not go fight. This is also the part of the brain you need in perfect order if you're going to deceive someone. Fake sincerity. Yeah. Fake sincerity. Sometimes you have to get a little buzz to tolerate somebody that you're talking to that you don't like. There's also part of the brain that you need in perfect order if you're going to deceive someone, fake sincerity, or try to trick someone. And one of the ways alcohol helps with these cooperation dilemmas, it makes us both more trusting and more trustworthy. If you drink some alcohol, you downregulate your prefrontal cortex, you're less able to lie. So in Japan, a lot of business deals are done while drunk. Like, it's actually like a cultural thing. The thing is, you don't know these people, and by getting liquored up, it's almost like you're becoming vulnerable. That, hey, I'm drinking, I'm making myself vulnerable. It's harder to deceive somebody when you're a little bit drunk. And when you get drunk together, it's like, okay, I trust you now. Interesting, in Japan, you can actually pay somebody to get drunk for you. For example, let's say you don't want to drink. So you could pay someone to get drunk. Then when they're about to sign the deal, you come in, you sign the deal, and then you leave. As long as you have somebody there getting drunk. Yeah, it's become so ingrained in their society that they actually have people getting paid to get drunk for the bosses, for the CEOs. Lying is a really cognitively complex activity, and the PFC is a center of self-control, focus, suppression of emotions, and expressions of desires, blah, blah. You need to have all of that in top shape to deceive someone. If I take a couple of shots of tequila, I'm less able to do that. And so you're more likely to trust me for good reason. At the same time, alcohol is boosting the production of these chemicals that make us like other people. Serotonin, endorphins, also dopamine. Alcohol played a role in decreasing our stress in the face of shifting to this very dense agricultural lifestyle, helped us genuinely create new bonds with strangers. I mean, yeah, like you probably went to a bar and there's like a drunk, friendly guy who normally might be introverted and not talk to anyone at work. Alcohol lowers your inhibitions and make you more social. And especially during the agricultural revolution, when you're not in the tribe that you've seen like every day in your life, you have to work with strangers. And we know that people used to drink in the morning all day. Probably they were never sober. Especially during the gin craze, it was postulated that perhaps maybe people were never even sober after the age of 5 because they've been drinking since childhood. So they just never took a break. It's not an accident that anytime you're getting people together who have potentially different interests or potentially hostile parties to get together, the intoxicants come out. Most of the time, it's alcohol. In places where they don't have alcohol for whatever reason, it's some other intoxicant that has very similar effects. And that's because people have learned that it's a tool you can use to lower people's cognitive dissonance. Compare how it is shake hands to not showing. This is funny. I actually just recently learned this. That the reason why you shake hands is like, oh yeah, I don't have any weapons. But it's like, well, what if you're carrying a sword on a scabbard or something? In the same way, when you sit down at a negotiating table with somebody and you eat a meal and you drink, you start drinking alcohol, you're basically taking out your prefrontal cortex and putting it on the table saying, hey, I'm cognitively disarmed. You can trust what I'm saying. It's more likely to be true. It's not an accident that cross-culturally around the world, you see intoxicants coming out during these social situations. People know consciously or not that it's an important tool. I kind of want to go back even further in human history. I've heard that something like 10 million years ago, it's theorized that the planet was warming and caused a lot of fruit to fall off and ferment. And that was actually protective, that as human primates, we have enzymes to metabolize alcohol. A lot of mammals don't. This is true. A lot of frugivores, animals that eat fruit, are able to process alcohol because it is a natural byproduct of spontaneous fermentations, which a lot of natural sources of sugar is fruit. To them, ethanol is complete poison. So the fact that we can eat this fruit that was fermenting was a protective factor that enhanced evolution. So it's certainly the case that we're part of a group of animals that can metabolize ethanol. Not just primates, birds do it as well. Okay, that's interesting. I didn't know. I mean, it makes sense. I've never seen a drunk bird, even though the other day I saw a pigeon fly into a glass window and knocked itself out. We're part of a lineage of primates that adapted to eating food that contained ethanol. And there's some theories that there's increased pressure on us to do this once we moved out of trees and we were living on the floor of these jungles and scattered grasslands. Now we're eating fallen fruit that's got a lot more ethanol in it. So that means overripe fruit, which probably was broken and exposed the juice to yeast because it's overripe, so it's going to have a lot of sugars that can ferment into ethanol. One of the things about alcohol that makes it special is that we have got a dedicated machinery in our body to get it out of us as quickly as possible. The drunken monkey hypothesis tries to explain why we have the taste for alcohol. Why do we like it? Robert Dudley of UC Berkeley, this is his thesis that in our evolutionary past, there's an advantage of being able to detect ethanol. Ethanol is a pretty volatile chemical. It travels long distances. You can smell alcohol pretty far away. His theory is that the smell of ethanol is like a dinner gong. We developed this ability to detect ethanol from long distances. We could follow the smell and find this ripe fruit that was a really big calorie package. And that was adaptive, and that's why we have a taste for alcohol. Even fruit flies can actually smell alcohol. They also smell vinegar, and the idea is because the fruit flies are attracted to rotten fruit, both vinegar and alcohol are byproducts of rotten fruit that isn't present in regular unrotten fruit. One of the main purposes of my book, Drunk, is to explain why we like to drink. Alcohol is a really harmful substance. It can lead to all these social and physical problems. In Dudley's case, he thinks that in our evolutionary past, it was good to like alcohol because calories were in short supply. If we can find fermented fruit, we should eat it right away. This taste becomes maladaptive in our modern environment. Problem with this theory is that there are substances that aren't carcinogenic and aren't going to hurt your liver and cause you to fall off a cliff because you're drunk. But we chose alcohol. There's got to be something special, something going on. The Lancet and many other medical journals have come out with these papers stating there's no safe amount of alcohol to be ever consumed. So where does alcohol fit in our present day? There's an infamous Lancet study and some other studies that argue that the net effect physiologically of alcohol is at best zero, neutral, and probably negative. There's debate about this, but in a way I don't really care. Maybe it's the case that it's a net physiological negative, and I think what's really stunted our conversations about this is we're looking at a purely medicalized lens and only in terms of physiological impact. And I think that that's the wrong way to look at it. So that's kind of interesting. It is the poison, but at the same time, it's like our genetics through evolution doesn't really care about our health sometimes and puts us into risk of harming ourselves. But if it helps a group of people survive or cooperate to function in society, I do argue in the book that alcohol is much more dangerous now than it has been for almost all of our evolutionary history. One argument is distillation, for one, is not natural. So it allowed us to create alcohol at a higher concentration that it normally isn't available. It's one thing to eat fermented mangoes, but you probably can't eat that much to get that drunk. The second thing is that the yeast today is actually cultivated to increase the alcohol that it can produce. Most of the time, natural fermentations stop once it reaches a high enough alcohol level because the yeast actually ends up killing itself from its own alcohol. But these cultivated yeasts have a higher tolerance to alcohol, So they can ferment at a higher rate. Like wine, for example, can be up to 18%, and some beers that can go up to like 50% alcohol, which through natural means without distillation. And I think that's kind of crazy that we are able to train yeast to do this, because the alcohol is poison to them too. Alcohol for most of our history has come to built-in safety feature, which is natural fermentation can only get you so far. Alcohol is actually the result of this biological warfare between yeast and bacteria, who are both trying to get these nutrients. So the yeast kill off the bacteria with ethanol, but they eventually shut themselves down because they're not infinitely resistant to ethanol. They're just more resistant than bacteria are. So yeah, I talked about how fermentation will stop once the alcohol level gets too high. Historically, yeast kind of pooped out pretty early in the process. So grain-based beers will only get to 2 to 3% ABV. So as I mentioned, these beers will get you buzzed, but probably the alcohol content from beers and fermented fruits wasn't probably high enough to get us that drunk. Probably just a little bit faded. But the alcohol that we have right now is so much higher than it was before. There are people who suspect that maybe that's why there's so many problems with alcohol. It's not the alcohol itself, it's just the amount of alcohol has been way more concentrated. We've been breeding yeast for thousands of years to make them more tolerant for alcohol so we can get stronger and stronger beers and wines. But even with that effort, we haven't gotten that much farther. Some craft beers can get to double digits now. Wines tend to max out at 17%. Yeah, so distillation that's the man-made part. This is the part where we took something that nature was limited to and made it better for our own purposes. So this explains how it works. You take alcohol that's produced, you refine it, get rid of as much water as possible, up to 90%. Yeah, vodkas that are that strong. Yeah, vodkas you can go as high as 98%, and then you put water in it to bring it down to like 80 proof, which is 40% alcohol. Yeah, distilled liquors are still just ethanol, but I think it should really be considered a completely different drug. It's way stronger, wildly stronger than naturally fermented beverages that our body are not equipped to handle. You start doing shots of 90-something proof vodka or tequila and our physiology is completely overwhelmed. That's more dangerous. Yeah, I've actually met people who actually continue to drink, but just no hard liquor. Traditionally, alcohol was consumed in communal, social, ritual contexts with built-in rules about drinking, ways to kind of regulate people's consumption rates, ways to stop people when they have too much. Another safety feature that's been disabled. Right now from my apartment in Vancouver, I can call my liquor store and have them deliver a case of tequila. Oh yeah, especially during the lockdown. I remember like ordering cases of White Claw and boxed wine. I mean, that was the only way to do it in the beginning when we couldn't even get inside. We're not even allowed to leave our houses. That's also evolutionary unprecedented. Private access to alcohol is unprecedented. So when you combine the two, now we have private access to alcohol. We have private access to super powerful, very dangerous form of alcohol. Alcohol has become a more dangerous tool, and so we have to be even more careful about using it than we have been historically. So yeah, like a lot of our adaptive behaviors that helped us survive back in the earlier times have now actually become a poison because we refined it. It's kind of like sugar. Our palate, the reason why we're attracted to sugar is because our bodies were designed to consume fruit as part of our diet. But then once we learned to refine that sugar, that's when sugar became a problem. You don't have animals that eat fruit struggling with diabetes or being overweight from eating too much fruit. But you do have a lot of people who are getting health problems from drinking too much sugared sodas. So this is just 0 calories ginger ale, in case you're wondering. But yeah, what do you guys think about this article? I think it's very interesting. I think I do agree with the general notion that alcohol was pretty important in the beginning, and once we got smart about it, a lot of the new problems regarding alcohol primarily came from our abilities to improve on what nature could possibly do and beat the limit of what natural fermentations can do, breeding yeast to tolerate higher alcohol, and then distillation to refine the alcohol so that you don't have to get it to levels that we've never seen in history. So I thought this article was interesting. Let me know what you think. Do you guys drink? Do you think alcohol is a poison to society? Do you think that a small amount of alcohol is actually beneficial, even necessary for today's society? And I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys on the next one.